This is Monocle on Design, a show where we discuss everything from architecture and craft to furniture and fashion. I'm Nick Manise. On today's program, we visit a Georgian design studio, take a tour of ghost signs in London, and visit a new exhibition on the work of Zaha Hadid architects. All that coming up on Monocle on Design. We start today's episode in Tbilisi and a visit to the design practice Rooms Studio. Focusing on collectible design with a strong connection to Georgia, the studio honours traditional craft. Its output often features motifs from historical designs from the region, as well as reproduced pieces from the country's long history and Soviet era. Monocle's Gabriella Delasanti paid a visit to Rooms Studio to meet its founders and sent us this report.
I'm in the Vera neighborhood of Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. This lively part of the city is characterized by a grid of narrow streets, lined with small wine shops, popular cafes, bookstores and restaurants serving classic Georgian fare. In the heart of the neighborhood, the local design practice Rooms Studio is housed in a historic building with long balconies adorned with intricate wooden carvings. Inside, high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows create an ideal setting for the studio's diverse collection of furnishings, gathered over the 17 years since its founding. I visit the studio on a warm September morning, where co-founder Nata Janbaridze, who is regularly based in Tbilisi, gave me a tour and began by sharing how it all started.
It started quite long ago, in 2003, when me and Katie Toloraya, who is my partner in work, we founded a room studio. We were studying together at Tbilisi Academy of Arts for interior design faculty, and just right away after the graduation we started to work for some projects together, and in 2007 we formed the studio Rooms.
A watershed moment for the practice that allowed founders Nata and Katie to define their identity as a design studio occurred when one of their lamp designs won the 2010 Salone Satellite Award in Milan and was set to be mass-produced. However, this was not the direction the studio wanted to pursue.
In the beginning, in early years of our practice, we were doing some pieces that were considered for the mass production, but later we just acknowledged that it's impossible to produce high-quality mass production pieces in Georgia, and that led us to some understanding that we would prefer to make more artisanal and limited edition objects, working close with the artisans, really small studios, and being involved in the production of every piece. It helped us to somehow create our own direction and to understand what we really want to do.
This led the studio to a new direction with their first series of collectible designs called Wild Minimalism. Most importantly, this marked the beginning of the studio's exploration into the roots of Georgian design, delving into past crafts, traditional materials, and reviving practices from earlier times. It also provided a way to reflect on the country's history, its identity straddling Europe and Asia, and its journey towards newfound independence.
That became really interesting to us to explore and to dive into the roots of Georgian designs. We started to use the techniques that were used by our ancestors and came up with this new collection, Wild Minimalism, that shows the primitivity and simplicity of carving in wood and stone. These pieces were quite archaic and wild, but really minimalist at the same time, had a contemporary appearance. That was the first sculptural furniture collection that we made, and we just understood that we want to explore more and create more about that thematic.
While touring the space, Nata pauses by a design from this collection that exemplifies the studio's approach. It's a long, solid oak bench with curled ends, supported by 2 thick bases at either end, and detailed carvings cover its surface. The original design dates back to the Soviet era and was originally used as a bus stop bench.
They were casted in concrete. It was a mass production of the bus stop benches, used in different places in Tbilisi and outside of Tbilisi as well in Georgia. And we find this iconic design so important that we don't want to lose it. Some of them are disappearing in the streets, some of them are broken and we see them vanishing, and we want to give a second life to such objects and try to recreate them somehow.
This effort to celebrate original Georgian design led to the creation of another intriguing collection called Street Series. This features vernacular designs that Nata and Keti discovered on the streets of Tbilisi.
We find them interesting in terms of their shapes and spontaneous designs that are made by people who just make them out of their needs, where they don't find any public furniture and they just need to relax or sit near the parking places or some flea markets. They use the materials that are just at hand in the moment. These tables or chairs and the daybeds that they make give us a huge inspiration. Sometimes we recreate these pieces for ourselves and make them in casted aluminium or in wood, monumentalize them. To preserve them in a way, it's a part of the charms of our city that's quite diverse and always changing, and you never know what you will see in the street another day. So it really reflects the spirit of and the energy of Tbilisi.
Aside from working on each collection, which Nata describes as always open and expandable with whatever ideas and inspiration come next, the studio is also dedicated to numerous interior design projects both in Georgia and abroad.
We consider the space as a sculptural piece. Our thinking process is the same way as we do in our collectible furniture. The space becomes more sculptural and it expresses, and it's sort of a one expression of what we want to say at once. So that's what we want to achieve in our interior designs. For example, we did a rooms hotel in Bakuriani, it's skiing resort in Georgia. And I think it really shows our practice well, because you can see a lot of furniture and objects that we've commissioned for them. Also some pieces from our wild minimalism collections. And the space became quite sculptural in terms of wholeness that it carries. And I think it really combines all the aspects and all the materials that we use in our collectible furniture and all the shapes. Also, its spirit is the same expression of what we want to achieve in our sculptural objects.
For Monocle Radio in Tbilisi, Georgia, I am Gabriele Delisanti.
Monocle's free-to-subscribe daily email newsletters, the Monocle Minute and Weekend Edition, deliver headlines and a swathe of recommendations from our editors, correspondents and bureau. You can also browse a menu of radio highlights and Monocle films. Our weekend newsletters deliver great columns from Andrew Tuck on Saturdays and Tyler Brulé on Sundays, cultural highs, media diets and far-off newspapers, recipes to cook at home. It's a fun take on weekend living. Head to monocle.com/minute to be part of the conversation.
Welcome back, and I am joined in the studio by this show's producer, Maylee Evans. Because, Maylee, you've been wandering around our neck of the woods and looking at ghost signs. What are ghost signs?
Well, I thought, we're getting into the spooky season and maybe to celebrate if you're that way inclined.
I am that way inclined. I like this.
Ghost signs, for those unfamiliar with the term, are those fading remnants of hand-painted signs that you typically find on brick walls. And they often hint to a past of commerce. And if your neighbourhood is a couple of decades old and managed to survive gentrification and a few licks of paint, you might see them showing their age.
Yeah, like kind of classic. I'm picturing like, you know, a Kellogg's cereal advertisement from 1950, like that sort of vibe. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly it. Those sort of big signs. Today's equivalent might be like a big billboard, but often these were commissioned and painted directly onto the walls. They operate in an interesting place because often people feel very, very strongly about these signs in their neighbourhood. They might be considered a cultural artefact or landmark that should be cherished. And so there's a question of whether they should be restored, should they be left, whose role is it to upkeep them, if they should be kept. I think they throw up lots of questions about design and how we consider its preservation.
Yeah, they almost become, you know, like a wayfinding marker, you know, like, oh yeah, again, to use that Kellogg's example, but, you know, turn right at the cornflakes advertisement that you'll see on the wall by the shop. Like that, they sort of become, yeah, I guess these markers. What exactly are we going to hear? Like, are you just wandering around the street talking about your favourite ghost signs?
No, not quite. I did enlist the help of an expert. So I took a tour alongside Sam Roberts. Now, he's the editor and publisher of a magazine about sign painting called Blag, but he also hosts these ghost sign tours across the city of London, so is very well versed with some of the issues I guess we've just outlined.
Well, I was just coming up to meet you, Maylie, and as I was passing, I happened to see the ladder, and I'm always eagle-eyed for a bit of traditional sign painting. And sure enough, it's my namesake, in fact, a chap called Sam. He's up there on the ladder, filling in at the moment a letter O in a green colour. So he's already set out the pattern that he's drawn previously and transferred onto the wall, and now he's painting it. And this is for All Nations Vegan Restaurant here on Stoke Newington High Street. For me, it's always pleasant because it just reassures me that there's still people doing it and doing it the right way. It's much more easy on the eye and calming than a lot of the garish, illuminated and protruding signs that we see up and down our high streets. So for me, it's part relief and part joy. We're here on Tyson Road, and what we're looking at is a large wall. It's above the shop that's there on the corner. It's a huge multi-panelled painted sign. What's wonderful about this is that you can see a sort of onion layer of history visible on the wall there. As the newer signs fade, the most recently painted ones, older signs and layers of lettering beneath them become gradually visible. And there's at least 3 different layers on this wall, all advertising a builders, merchants and ironmongers called Cakebread, Roby & Co. What's intriguing, when you look at these layers that have built up over time, they're actually decreasing the size of their letters in order to add more and more of their products and services. So the older layers, 3 lines of text on one of the panels, whereas the newer layers got 5 lines of text. And in order to fit that all in, they've had to reduce the sizes. It's mainly set there on a white background with the lettering in red, but that's faded to a sort of rusty colour over time. While some people might look at that and think of it as somewhat an eyesore, for me it's just this wonderful layering up of history and all the little stories that it can tell.
I suppose just picking up this idea of an eyesore, because I suppose it's easy now to look at these and feel a bit nostalgic, but there was a time where maybe they might have seen them the same way we might see digital billboards.
Absolutely. We consider ourselves these days, certainly in the digital realm and to an extent in the public realm, to be bombarded by advertising. But if you look at photographs from the late Victorian era, early 20th century, when the majority of these signs, at least the ones that survive, were painted, people then were absolutely bombarded by signage on every possible surface. While some have survived, we have to remember the wider context of when these were created was an avalanche of unregulated, to some extent, advertising. There's something about the passage of time that makes these things intriguing, that window into the past that they offer. The reason that this became less prevalent as a form of advertising was twofold. Local shops and businesses moved towards different technologies, neon, moulded plastics, and other new forms of signage, and it fell out of fashion for those uses. And then with respect to, say, bigger brands or advertising, so you do see these ghost signs for companies such as Gillette or Bovril or Hovis. In those cases, they began to mass print billboards that they would be very confident in the reproduction quality of those across multiple sites, and it was cheaper than paying somebody to go up there on a brush. So it was technology that really saw these begin to phase out from the 1940s onwards, really.
All right, stop number 3. Okay. I've one question, which is this idea of whether you try and preserve them or let them fade away, knowing that there's going to be a new generation of advertising. Maybe it doesn't look quite as beautiful, but it's kind of an ephemeral piece of design. Where do you stand?
There's been discussion of, perhaps using varnishes or other things to arrest the development, to freeze them at some point in time. That's quite an arbitrary decision about what point in time that happens. My general thought on it is that we should let them age gracefully. And I know that riles some people up because, especially when it's your local sign, it has much more of a personal and community connection. However, I say let them age gracefully at the same time as I would advocate painting new signs. Let's promote and nurture the craft so that we can be painting signs today that will be our ghost signs for future generations. And that feels to me much more like the natural cycle of life, and not to get too hung up and nostalgic about each individual sign, much as that irks some people.
I read really briefly that there's some examples where there'll be like a city or a town where they've got old signs and they repaint them and make it feel a bit like the 50s.
The mass repainting of signs is something that does happen. It's very common in the Netherlands. You also find it is quite prevalent in the United States. I've heard it referred to as the Disneyfication, and I think that's a really good encapsulation of it, because something is lost when you apply that new paint to the old sign. Sure, in their day they would have been maintained and kept up, repainted every few years to keep them fresh, but once they've become redundant and begin that aging process and fading, interrupting that and applying the fresh paint to it means that something is lost. That original connection to the history that the sign contains is diminished. So I personally tend not to go for that, but at the same time I'm not banging my drum and lobbying people not to do it. I just say, really, if you are going to do it properly and employ professionals to get the job done. The Netherlands offers up some very good examples of where it's been done sensitively to the original artwork. I have also seen cases where it's been retouched rather than fully repainted. So when it reaches a point where it ceases to be legible anymore, elements are brought back while retaining that ghosted, faded aspect. The other thing I have seen in places are perspex coverings, mainly there to protect it from vandalism, but that's another approach that can work. And I think there's other things that can be done to celebrate them and to value them, such as plaques at street level. Have something there at eye level that gives a bit of context for the sign above. Equally, if you are going to repaint them, make sure that there's lots of documentary photography before that paint gets applied, so that you have a historical record, and that should be kept at a local archives or an equivalent organisation.
These sort of ghost signs, they're in an interesting place because they're public, but they're on private buildings, so there's always this sort of tension as to who gets to pick what gets kept or what maybe is a bit ugly and could be redeveloped.
It's something that I touch on my tours is, these signs exist at the intersection of private and public ownership. So while they are present on private property, there's a sense of them being in the public realm and the public having ownership of them and being part of the public memory. That can create tension when private property owners do things that damage or diminish the signs themselves. And you see cases of this. For example, on Clapham High Street, there was once a wonderful sign for the music roll exchange, and just one day the owner of that property whitewashed it out, and that caused a whole uproar. And in fact, a question was asked to the mayor at the time, Ken Livingstone, what are you doing to protect these ghost signs? And he deferred it down to council level. With respect to then what can councils do, well, not a great deal. They can add these signs to what are called their local lists. It means that if a property owner does want to make substantial change to a building, then they have to consider the effects of that change on the sign, but it wouldn't stop something like in that case that's effectively redecoration. There's not really any sort of hard legal protections for these signs, and my overall approach or strategy, if you like, is to make more and more people aware of them, because I think that as people become aware of them and become aware of the history that they imbue, one by one property owners will go, actually, I'm going to keep that, because that adds value to my building. It adds heritage and intrigue to my building rather than being an eyesore that detracts value. And I'm seeing increasingly examples of that, where restoration projects, especially with shop fronts, and people decide to keep an old original shop front in situ while the rest of the property is redecorated. That then adds to the story, the intrigue, the fascination with that building. I don't think that legal measures and campaigning is the way to save the ghost signs. I think the way that they will be saved is through the actions of the people that own their host buildings.
That was Sam Roberts. What I actually quite like about this is, and maybe this is a little bit ignorant from me, and you'd hope that maybe as design editor I wasn't so ignorant about something like this, but I guess I didn't particularly think of sign painting as this discipline that really has a craft and attention to detail to it. But what Sam's talking about there is a real talent. I mean, do you have a desire to become a sign painter now? Do you have a new appreciation for it? Tell me a little bit about, I guess, what you picked up from it.
For me, I mean, my hand is definitely not steady enough for some of those clean lines there. What I found really important about the points that Sam's making is that it's great that we can recognise the importance of some of this signage, but also to not forget that this is a current practice that is happening today. And it's really important that we are encouraging the next generation to sort of have those commissions, to have the space to practice this craft, because those will be the ghost signs of the future. And for me, that was the biggest thing, not to get too hung up on certain examples, but to try and encourage and more of this to flourish.
What was also fascinating, his talk about the Disneyfication of preservation, and I think that is a theme or a topic that relates to so many different disciplines. It's like this, how do you preserve things in a way that feels authentic? If I'm going to jump across to architecture now and use that as a comparison point, I think often the best preservation projects are the ones that don't try to hide the new components as, something that's old and has always been there. There's still got to be an honesty to it. I think people really respond to that sort of honesty. So I thought that was a beautiful thread that he also picked up on. A wonderful report and a wonderful reminder that design, graphics, craft surround us all the time. My thanks to Maylee Evans for that report. For our final piece, we're staying in London, where the Zaha Hadid Foundation's latest exhibition showcases how its namesake architect used paper reliefs to shape the design of 3 key museums. The showcase, Zaha Hadid Paper Museums, features models of the Contemporary Art Centre in Cincinnati, the Maxi Museum of 21st Century Arts in Rome, and the unrealised Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. For each of these projects, paper reliefs were used to translate 2D forms, initially conceived as paintings, into 3D works. Monocle's Sana Jumani visited the exhibition to meet its curator, Catherine Howe.
Architectural models are used to represent buildings, so they can be presentation models to show a kind of finished building, but they can also be conceptual, so they can show different ideas that are key to a project. You have this really interesting idea with the paper reliefs that they show things that are almost like abstract art, and she's also using them to represent art museums as well. So there's this really nice playfulness about the medium of the paper relief, that you can hang it on the wall, but it's also showing a key project like Contemporary Arts Centre in Cincinnati or the Maxi Museum in Rome.
The exhibit showcases 3 key museum designs from Zaha Hadid: the Contemporary Art Centre, the Museum of 21st Century Arts, and the Museum of Islamic Art. These models offer a dual purpose, one that is both functional and aesthetic.
With the paper reliefs on display, they are kind of an art form, and you can appreciate the materiality and the kind of complexity of process, like cutting and folding of the card and paper. But also with projects like CAC, for example, there's a really lovely model that could be an abstract work of art, but it also looks just like the building, and it shows key concepts about deconstructing the city grid and things that are really important to how the building works. So this idea of the urban carpet that flows up from the street level is a key concept. And you see that in the curve in the corner of the work. And then you see these sort of cube or box-like forms above, and they are the jigsaw puzzle, which is the gallery spaces. And they're made of solids and voids. And the relief actually then reflects that in how it operates, where you have sort of recessed parts and then protruding parts. So you get a sense of its three-dimensionality. And these reliefs are really lovely and interesting insofar as they are sometimes like sketches. They show an idea that's been done quickly, or they are a presentation model that kind of plays with space, that takes the line into something three-dimensional. Mm-hmm. And I think that in-betweenness is really nice for these. So they help people to understand the buildings, but also their potential and different ideas around them.
Hadid's early work developed and paved the way for the paper models we see on display.
There's an interesting history with Zaha Hadid's architecture and paper, because she was often quite disparagingly referred to as a paper architect, because it took her many years to have one of her projects realised as a building. Her office started out as a painting practice during the 1980s, and they created incredible abstract paintings that were propositions for buildings. And they take that and develop it, I think. So I think the relief is partly a development of her earlier work within the office, but it's also something responding to the longer history of 20th century modernism and abstract art as well.
The models in the exhibit present different angles and alternative perspectives of the sites. Many of them are quite abstract, providing viewers with the opportunity to try and understand the sites in more unconventional ways. So, why paper as opposed to another medium, like technical drawings?
I think the reliefs allow you to see things like the flow within the city. You have the American grid system for CAC, and then you have the historic city grid in Rome, and the reliefs allow you to get a sense of the layout and what she's doing with the urban fabric. So you have kind of cutting and carving and exploding the grid in the CAC models, and that's done with these incredibly precise relief models that kind of cut and carve, quite literally, but with paper, the kind of forms of the city. The relief, I think, conveys that in a way that other media wouldn't be able to.
The projects in the exhibition represent a period from the late 90s to the early 2000s, a time when computer-aided and computer-generated designs were not as popular as they are now. Despite technological innovations, these analog models still play a key role for viewers today in engaging with these sites.
There are a couple of interesting aspects about why people find paper so engaging, our audience would find paper so engaging in an exhibition like this, is there's still a tactility and materiality to it that appeals. It's quite an approachable medium, but you can do incredibly complex things with something that is quite everyday. And it's still used because it's a way of form finding, or it's still a physical entity to test things, which you can't necessarily do directly with digital models.
The physicality of these models is so central to the understanding of the sites. As curator of the exhibition, Catherine hopes that visitors, especially those who don't know much about architecture and design, will learn more about the many ways buildings can be represented and the possibilities that come with that.
There's always a complexity to exhibiting architecture, in fact, because you can't have the building within a gallery space. So how you represent it is always full of exciting possibilities. The relief models show how architecture can be represented, how it can be explored, how it can be developed, and also sort of making and design processes and different aspects around its concepts, its presentation, the relationship to site. I think there's an appeal in the unexpected, actually, that these are quite dynamic and inventive things. I think they help people to see existing buildings in a different way. Maxi and CAC they've become quite famous, iconic Zaha buildings in their own right. So in one sense, the paper reliefs, I think, help people to see things with fresh eyes, if you like. They're kind of a new way of seeing architecture that they perhaps wouldn't be so familiar with.
For Monocle in London, I'm Sana Jumani.
The exhibition Zaha Hadid Paper Museums is on at the Zaha Hadid Foundation in London until the 16th of November 2024. And that's all for today's show. For more design stories, listen to our 5-minute midweek bonus show, Monocle on Design Extra, which airs on Thursdays. And if you enjoy print, then do pick up a copy of Monocle magazine as well. It's on all good newsstands now. Today's episode was produced and edited by Maylee Evans. I'm Nick Manise, and you can reach me on nm@monocle.com. Thanks for listening.